The rain in Savannah didn't just fall, it clung. It draped itself over the city like a shroud of liquid silver, turning the historic cobblestones of River Street into a slick, dark mirror that reflected the ghostly glow of the old-fashioned gas lamps. Water dripped from the gnarled branches of ancient oaks, each drop tracing a path through the thick veils of Spanish moss that gave the city its soul and its secrets. It was a night for ghosts, poets, and desperate people. Elara Vance felt she was, in some small way, all three. Inside her small, second-floor studio overlooking a quiet lane just off the main thoroughfare, the world was a chaotic sanctuary of her own making. The air smelled of turpentine, linseed oil, and the dry, sweet scent of aging canvas. Canvases in various states of repair leaned against the walls, their forgotten subjects waiting patiently for her steady hand to bring them back to life. Brushes of every size stood in clay pots like bouquets of worn bristles, and jars of pigments were arranged in a meticulous rainbow on a paint-splattered workbench. Elara herself was a study in contrasts. Her hands, stained with flecks of cerulean blue and burnt umber, moved with the precision of a surgeon as she applied the final, delicate touch of sealant to a silver filigree music box. The piece was exquisite, a relic from a bygone era, and its restoration had been a nerve-wracking 3-week ordeal. Now, under the warm light of her lamp, the intricate carvings of vines and hummingbirds gleamed as if new. She gently wound the small key, and a faint, ethereal melody, the ghost of a lullaby, tinkled through the quiet room. A soft buzz from her phone on the desk broke the spell. She wiped her hands on a rag and picked it up. A message from her younger brother, Leo. A sad smile touched Elara's lips. Leo's optimism was a relentless, brilliant sunbeam in the gathering storm of her life. That superhero cardiologist came with a price tag that felt more like a king's ransom. On her desk, beneath a stack of art history books, lay a pile of envelopes, each one stamped with a crimson, unforgiving overdue. Leo's heart was a fragile clock, and she was in a desperate race against its ticking. This music box was a crucial part of the plan. A side job, procured through her boss at the small gallery where she worked part-time. The client was wealthy, eccentric, and most importantly, anonymous, and he paid exceptionally well. The bonus for this late-night, personal delivery alone was enough to cover Leo's next consultation and the terrifyingly expensive diagnostic tests. For Leo, she would walk through any storm. Another buzz. This time it was Mr. Allister, the gallery owner. Elara's shoulders tensed. A late-night rendezvous on a deserted street corner felt like the beginning of a thriller novel. But the pragmatic part of her brain, the part that counted every dollar and weighed every risk, knew she had no choice. She carefully wrapped the silver music box in a swath of black velvet, then placed it inside a sturdy, waterproof satchel. Pulling on her worn but reliable trench coat, she took one last look around her studio. It was her haven, a place where she could mend the broken things of the world. But outside its doors, the world remained fractured in ways she couldn't fix with a brush and some patience. Stepping out into the Savannah night was like plunging into another century. The storm had chased away the tourists, leaving River Street hauntingly empty. Her boots echoed on the wet stones as she hurried past the dark windows of candy shops and taverns. The air was thick with the smell of the river, damp earth, and blooming night jasmine. The skeletal shadows of the oak branches danced on the brick walls of old cotton warehouses, and for a moment, she felt a primal chill that had nothing to do with the cold rain seeping into her collar. She clutched the satchel to her chest, the hard edges of the music box a solid reassurance against her ribs. The corner of Bay and Abercorn was just ahead, marked by a lonely, flickering gas lamp. It was an area of quiet wealth, where historic homes stood shoulder to shoulder with discreetly luxurious hotels. The street was deserted. She checked her phone. 10:58 p.m. She pulled the collar of her coat tighter, her gaze sweeping the rain-swept darkness. She felt exposed, a solitary figure in a vast, empty stage set. Was this a mistake? The thought was a cold knot in her stomach, but the image of Leo's hopeful smile pushed it away. Right on cue, as the clock on her phone turned to 11 p.m., a pair of brilliant white headlights sliced through the downpour. A vehicle approached, moving with a silent, imposing grace. It was a gleaming black Lincoln Navigator, its tinted windows obscuring any view of the interior. It was as sleek and menacing as a panther. It slowed and pulled to a smooth stop at the curb, its engine a barely perceptible hum beneath the drumming of the rain. It was here, just as Mr. Allister had said. Relief washed over her, so potent it almost made her knees weak. It was real. The money was real. Leo's superhero doctor was one step closer. She didn't want to linger in the rain for a second longer. Taking a deep, steadying breath to calm her racing heart, Elara squared her shoulders and walked purposefully toward the rear passenger door. This was just a delivery, a transaction. She would hand over the package, confirm the payment transfer, and be back in her studio within the hour. Simple. She reached the vehicle, the rain plastering strands of her hair to her cheek. She didn't hesitate. With a sense of finality, she pulled the heavy chrome handle. The door swung open with an expensive, muted click, revealing a dark, leather-scented interior. Without looking up, she quickly slid inside, eager to escape the storm. "I have the package," she said, her voice slightly breathless as she shook the rain from her coat. "Elara Vance, for the delivery." The door clicked shut behind her, sealing her inside a profound, unnerving silence. It was only then, as her eyes adjusted to the dim interior light, that she looked up and realized her mistake. A catastrophic, life-altering mistake. There was no friendly driver waiting to take her package. Instead, sitting across from her, was a man. He was shrouded in shadows, but even in the darkness, his presence filled the cavernous space with an aura of absolute, lethal stillness. All she could make out was the razor-sharp cut of a tailored suit and a pair of eyes, pale as a winter sky, that were fixed on her with an expression of cold, dangerous surprise. The car wasn't empty, and it wasn't waiting for an art restorer. The silence that followed her announcement was not empty. It was heavy, pressed, and cold, sucking the warmth from the car's interior. The gentle ticking of the rain on the roof was suddenly deafening. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the stillness. The man across from her didn't move a muscle, yet the shift in the atmosphere was as palpable as a drop in temperature. As her eyes adjusted, his face emerged from the shadows. It was a face that belonged on an old Roman coin, all sharp angles, harsh planes, and aristocratic severity. A strong jaw, a straight nose, and dark hair cut with disciplined precision. A faint, silvery scar cut through his left eyebrow, a tiny flaw in the otherwise imposing perfection. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of storm clouds over a frozen sea, a pale, penetrating gray that seemed to see not just her but through her, assessing every fear, every hope, every secret she possessed. He was not a client. He was a predator. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, velvet baritone that held no warmth, only absolute control. Elara Vance. He said her name not as a question but as a statement, as if weighing the sound of it on his tongue. "I was not expecting you." The blood drained from Elara's face. "Oh my God," she whispered, the reality crashing down on her. "I am so sorry. I think I must have the wrong car. My instructions said a black Lincoln Navigator." "There are many black Navigators in Savannah," he stated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He made no move to help her, his gaze unwavering. "Yes, of course. How stupid of me," she stammered, her professionalism giving way to pure, unadulterated panic. Her hand fumbled for the door handle. I'll get out of your way. I'm sorry to have bothered you." She pulled the handle. Nothing happened. She pulled it again, harder, her breath catching in her throat. A quiet, definitive click echoed from the dashboard as the driver in the front seat engaged the central locks. A cold dread, far more chilling than the rain, snaked its way up her spine. "The door seems to be locked," she said, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. "Indeed," the man replied, his expression unreadable. Desperate, she held up her satchel as if it were a shield. "Look, this is just a misunderstanding. I'm an art restorer. I was just supposed to deliver this." Her fingers trembled as she unwrapped the velvet, revealing the gleaming silver music box. "It's for a client, an antique. See? I'm nobody." He glanced at the delicate object, his gaze lingering on it for a fraction of a second before returning to her face. For the first time, a flicker of something not empathy, perhaps, but calculation crossed his features. He saw the genuine terror in her eyes, the worn collar of her coat, the desperate sincerity in her plea. He recognized the truth. She wasn't a threat. She was a stray lamb who had blundered into a lion's den. She was a complication. Before he could speak again, a second set of headlights illuminated the interior of the car. Through the rain-streaked windshield, Elara saw another identical black Navigator pull up to the exact spot on the corner where she had been waiting. Her driver. Her simple, safe transaction. Her escape. It was right there, 100 feet away, in a parallel world she could no longer access. "That's my car," she breathed, a sliver of hope piercing her fear. "Please, just let me go. I won't say anything. I haven't seen anything." "You are mistaken," the man said, his voice dropping even lower, taking on a hard, dangerous edge. You have seen me. As he spoke, the night outside erupted. A roaring engine tore through the quiet street, and a matte black Dodge Charger screeched to a halt behind them, blocking any chance of retreat. Two hulking figures emerged from the Charger, their broad shoulders and aggressive postures visible even through the downpour. They were not here for a polite conversation. Elara flinched, pressing herself back against the supple leather seat. The driver of their car, a large man named Luca, whose eyes she could now see in the rearview mirror, was perfectly still, his hands resting calmly on the steering wheel, his attention fixed on the men outside. The man across from her, Dante, didn't even flinch. His stillness had transformed from passive observation to coiled, lethal energy. He was a king on his throne, watching an insignificant rebellion unfold in his court. They're early, he murmured, more to himself than to her. He then raised his voice slightly. Luca, I see them, boss, the driver's voice rumbled back. Elara's world began to spin. Boss. The word hung in the air, heavy with implications she didn't want to comprehend. She was trapped in a car with a Mafia boss, a witness to a confrontation that was about to happen. Her life, her carefully constructed, fragile life, was shattering like glass. Dante's piercing gray eyes met hers one last time. He saw her pale face, her wide, terrified eyes, and the silver music box still clutched in her white-knuckled grip. A decision was made in that silent, frozen moment. She was a loose thread that could unravel everything. She could not be let go. He subtly touched his cufflink, which she now realized was a discreet communication device. Luca, he commanded, his voice now the embodiment of cold, sharp authority. Go. The command was absolute. Without a word, Luca stomped on the accelerator. The powerful engine of the Navigator roared to life, and the vehicle shot forward with a force that threw Elara back against her seat. The music box flew from her grasp, landing with a soft thud on the floor mat. Tires squealed on the wet cobblestones as Luca expertly swerved around a historic fountain in the center of the square, the Charger already in hot pursuit. The world outside became a watercolor blur of gaslight, ancient architecture, and torrential rain. They tore through the narrow, winding streets of Savannah's historic district, running red lights, their pursuers relentlessly close behind. Elara could only hold on, her mind reeling in shock and disbelief. An hour ago, her biggest worry was paying a medical bill. Now, she was a prisoner, caught in the crossfire of a war she didn't understand, speeding through the night with a man whose eyes promised nothing but darkness. Her simple, meticulously ordered life had not just been disrupted, it had been hijacked, and she had a terrifying feeling that the man sitting silently across from her was the one who now held the keys. Chapter 3. Symphony of Gunfire. The world was a maelstrom of sound and motion. The deep growl of the Navigator's engine, the high-pitched squeal of tires protesting on wet cobblestones, and the relentless drumming of the rain all merged into a chaotic symphony. Elara was thrown against the plush leather as Luca executed a turn so sharp that the historic buildings outside seemed to tilt on their foundations. She gripped the seat, her knuckles white, her mind struggling to catch up with the violent reality of her situation. Then came a new sound, one that tore through the others with brutal finality. Crack. The first gunshot was nothing like the movies. It wasn't a resonant boom, but a sharp, ugly sound that split the air. It was followed by a sickening thud of metal on metal somewhere behind them. Elara flinched so violently she hit her head on the window. Another crack followed, this time closer. A spiderweb of fractured glass bloomed in the rear window. This was real. The danger wasn't abstract anymore. It was a tangible thing, a shard of glass, a piece of speeding lead. Her heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of her chest. Her frantic gaze flew to the man opposite her. Dante Moretti might as well have been listening to a classical concerto for all the emotion he showed. His face remained a mask of cold composure, his storm-gray eyes narrowed in concentration, not on her, but on the reflections in the side mirror. He was utterly, terrifyingly calm. This was his world. He was not a visitor here. He was the conductor. Left on Broughton, he commanded, his voice never rising above a low murmur. Use the lane. They're anticipating it. Luca's gruff voice came from the front. They're trying to cut us off. Panic, raw and acidic, rose in Elara's throat. They were trapped. She was going to die here, in a stranger's car, in a battle that had nothing to do with her. Her mind screamed with the image of Leo, alone, waiting for a sister who would never come home. The thought was more terrifying than any bullet. If she died, who would fight for him? Just as the Charger began to gain on them on a straight stretch of road, Luca wrenched the wheel hard to the right. It wasn't a street he turned into, but a narrow, unlit alleyway Elara had only ever walked through in the daylight. The huge SUV barely fit. The side mirrors scraped against brick walls with a horrific screeching sound, sending sparks into the rain-soaked darkness. Gravity ceased to be a suggestion. Elara was thrown sideways, a strangled cry escaping her lips as she tumbled across the seat, directly toward Dante. She braced for impact, but instead of hitting the hard lines of the opposite door, her momentum was abruptly arrested. A hand, strong as steel, clamped down on her shoulder. The grip was not gentle, but it was steady, anchoring her in the chaos. Through the thin fabric of her coat, she could feel the unyielding strength in his fingers, a shocking, solid warmth that stood in stark contrast to his icy demeanor. Her wide, terrified eyes met his. For a split second, the world narrowed to the few inches between them. She saw the minute flecks of darker gray in his irises, the rigid set of his jaw. There was no comfort in his gaze, only an intense, dangerous focus. The moment was shattered as Luca exited the alley, fishtailing back onto another street. Dante released her just as quickly as he had grabbed her, and she scrambled back to her side of the car, the phantom pressure of his hand still burning on her shoulder. They had gained some distance, but the Charger's roaring engine was soon audible again. Dante let out a sigh, a soft sound of pure annoyance, as if he were dealing with a persistent pest. This is tiresome. With a fluid, economical movement, he reached down and pressed a nearly invisible seam in the floor panel. A small, upholstered section slid open, revealing a compartment lined with dark foam. Nestled within was a matte black handgun. Elara's breath hitched. He retrieved the weapon with a familiarity that spoke of long practice. It looked like a natural extension of his hand. He didn't look at her. He simply pressed a button, and the heavily tinted window beside him slid down by a few inches, letting in a spray of rain and the sounds of the city at war. Without leaning out, without taking obvious aim, he extended his arm into the gap. The sound of the gunshot inside the car was deafening, a brutal explosion that made Elara scream, clamping her hands over her ears. He fired only once. She risked a glance out the back window. She saw the Charger swerve violently. A plume of sparks erupted from its front right wheel as the rim ground against the asphalt. The vehicle spun out of control, its chase ending abruptly as it slammed sideways into an ornate cast-iron lamppost. Silence descended once more, broken only by the engine's purr and the steady rhythm of the windshield wipers. They had escaped. The Navigator slowed, its pace becoming leisurely, unremarkable. It melted back into the sparse late-night traffic as if nothing had happened. Elara was left trembling, breathless, the echo of the gunshot still ringing in her ears. A few minutes later, they turned into the entrance of a luxury residential building. The vehicle descended into a private, subterranean garage. A massive steel gate rolled shut behind them with a heavy, final groan, the sound of a tomb being sealed. The engine cut out and the ensuing silence was absolute. Luca got out of the driver's seat and stood, sentinel-like, a few feet away. Dante finally turned his full attention back to her. In the dim, clinical light of the garage, his face seemed even more severe, his eyes colder. He studied her, this disheveled, terrified girl who had crashed into his perfectly controlled world. "Welcome to my home, Miss Vance," he said, his voice flat and final. "There will be rules now. You would be wise to learn them." Dante led her from the silent concrete of the garage to a private elevator set flush against the wall. The doors slid open without a sound, revealing a cabin of brushed steel and dark wood. He gestured for her to enter, and she complied, her body moving on autopilot. The brutal violence of the chase had left her feeling hollowed out, a puppet whose strings had been cut. The elevator ascended in a smooth, silent rush that did nothing to calm the frantic turmoil in her mind. When the doors opened again, they did not open into a hallway, but directly into the heart of a massive penthouse apartment. Elara's breath caught in her throat. After the grime and chaos of the night, the space was so clean, so ordered, it felt like stepping into another dimension. One entire wall was a sheet of glass, 2 stories high, showcasing a breathtaking rain-lashed panorama of Savannah. The city lights glittered below like a carpet of scattered diamonds, and the river was a winding ribbon of black ink in the distance. The apartment itself was a masterpiece of cold, minimalist design. White marble floors gleamed under recessed lighting. The furniture was sparse, a low-slung black leather sofa, a glass coffee table, and chrome and leather chairs all exquisitely crafted and positioned with geometric precision. There were no photographs, no cluttered bookshelves, no signs of a life lived. It was not a home. It was a fortress disguised as a gallery, a beautiful, sterile cage, Dante walked to the center of the room, his expensive shoes making no sound on the polished floor. He removed his suit jacket, draping it over the back of a chair with an air of practiced ease. The handgun had vanished, but his aura of command remained, more potent than any weapon. "You will stay here," he said, his voice calm and level, cutting through the silence. It was not a request. Elara finally found her voice, a raw, ragged thing. "Stay here? You can't be serious. You have to let me go. This has nothing to do with me." "It has everything to do with you now," he countered, turning to face her. His gray eyes were unyielding. "You were seen. The men who were chasing us are my rivals. To them, you are not an innocent bystander. You are a witness, a potential associate, a liability, and they are not sentimental." He took a step closer, and she instinctively took a step back. "Let me be perfectly clear, Miss Vance," he continued, his tone patient, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. "Your life, as you knew it, is on hold. For your own safety, you are now under my protection. That protection comes with rules." He began to pace slowly, his presence dominating the vast space. "Rule 1. You will not leave this apartment. The elevator requires my fingerprint. The stairwell doors are alarmed. The windows are reinforced ballistic glass. Do not test the security. You will fail." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Rule 2. You will have no contact with the outside world. No phone, no internet. Your old life cannot know where you are. It is the only way to protect them as well as you." "My brother," she choked out, the words tasting like ash. "He'll be worried sick. He needs me." For the first time, Dante's cold expression shifted into something sharper, more predatory. He stopped pacing and looked directly at her. "Leo Michael Vance," he said, the name rolling off his tongue with chilling familiarity. 12 years old, resides at 124 Habersham Street with you. He is currently awaiting a consultation with Dr. Alistair Finch for a congenital ventricular septal defect. Elara felt the floor drop out from under her. He hadn't just learned her name. He had dissected her entire life in the short time since she'd stumbled into his car. He knew her greatest vulnerability. "How?" she whispered, horrified. "Information is my business," he said simply. "Which brings me to Rule 3. You will not ask questions about my business. You will live here. You will be given everything you need, and you will remain silent and invisible until I have dealt with the threat." He saw the defiant fire returning to her eyes and played his final, devastating card. "Your cooperation ensures Leo's well-being. Dr. Finch is a very busy man, but his schedule can be adjusted. The right donation to the hospital can accelerate things. Similarly, if my enemies were to believe your brother was a way to get to me, I cannot guarantee his safety." It was a perfectly delivered blow, a threat wrapped in a promise. He was offering to both save and endanger her brother in the same breath. He was taking control of the one thing that mattered most in her world. Tears of rage and helplessness burned in her eyes. She hated him. She hated him with a ferocity she had never known. She was trapped, and he had just locked the cage and thrown away the key. As if on cue, a side door opened and a stern-looking older woman with her gray hair pulled into a severe bun entered the room. She wore a simple black dress, and her expression was as neutral as the apartment's decor. "Sophia, this is Miss Vance. She will be staying with us for a while," Dante said. "Show her to the guest suite. See that she has everything she needs." The woman, Sophia, simply nodded, her dark eyes assessing Elara with a detached curiosity. "This way, miss." Defeated, Elara followed the housekeeper down a long, white hallway. The room Sophia led her to was just as luxurious and impersonal as the rest of the penthouse. It had a king-sized bed with crisp white linens, an ensuite bathroom of black marble, and its own floor-to-ceiling window with a view of the city's historic squares. It was the most beautiful room she had ever been in. Sophia laid out a set of silk pajamas on the bed. "If you require anything, use the intercom on the wall. Meals will be brought to you." Her tone was polite but firm, the voice of a professional jailer. Then she left, and Elara heard the soft, electronic click of the lock engaging from the outside. She was alone. She rushed to the window, pressing her hands against the cool, unyielding glass. The city glittered below, so close and yet a universe away. The adrenaline from the chase had finally worn off, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a crushing wave of despair. She was a prisoner in a gilded cage, her fate and the fate of her brother now held in the hands of the cold, ruthless man who was both her captor and her protector. She slid down to the floor, her back against the glass, and for the first time that night, Elara Vance allowed herself to break. The silent, hot tears she had been holding back finally fell, tracing paths down her cheeks as she wept for the life she had lost just a few short hours ago. Elara awoke to unfamiliar silence and the soft weight of 1,000 thread count sheet. For a disorienting second, the terror of the previous night felt like a hyper-realistic nightmare, a fever dream brought on by stress and exhaustion. Then she opened her eyes. The room was bathed in the cool gray light of a rainy Savannah morning. The panoramic window displayed the city as a muted watercolor painting of wet slate roofs and glistening green squares. The minimalist furniture and the oppressive perfection of the space were a stark, immediate reminder. This was real. This was her cage. A fresh wave of panic seized her, and she threw off the covers. Her first instinct was survival, the primal urge to try. The door handle didn't budge. It was as solid and unyielding as the man who had locked it. She ran her hands over the vast window, pressing against the cold, thick glass. It was seamless, with no latch, no handle, no hope of an opening. Dante's words echoed in her mind. "Do not test the security. You will fail." The confirmation sent a chill of helplessness through her. A short while later, a soft chime sounded, and the door clicked open. It was Sophia, the stern housekeeper, carrying a tray laden with a beautiful breakfast, fresh fruit, pastries, a silver pot of coffee, and a single white rose in a crystal vase. She placed the tray on a small table by the window without a word. "Where is he?" Elara demanded, her voice hoarse. Sophia continued her task, arranging the cutlery with practiced precision. "Mr. Moretti is unavailable at the moment. I need to call my brother. He'll be frantic. Can you at least pass on a message, just to let him know I'm okay?" Elara tried to appeal to the woman, searching her impassive face for a flicker of sympathy. "My instructions are to see to your needs within this suite, miss," Sophia replied, her voice polite but as hard as the marble floor. "That does not include outside communication." She turned to leave. "I am not your prisoner." Elara's voice rose, laced with desperation. Sophia paused at the door, her back still to Elara. "Mr. Moretti expects you to eat." The door clicked shut, the lock engaging with an electronic finality that mocked her outburst. Left alone, Elara stared at the tray. It was an offering for a prized pet, not a meal for a person. Every perfectly sliced piece of melon, every flaky croissant, felt like an insult. In her first act of rebellion, however small and futile, she refused to touch it. She would not accept the comforts of her captivity. She would not make this easy for him. An hour passed. The coffee grew cold. The pastries sat untouched. The silence of the penthouse was a living thing, amplifying the sound of her own ragged breathing. The door chimed and opened again. This time, it was Dante. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit, a stark white shirt, and a black tie. He looked rested, powerful, and in complete command of his world. His icy gaze immediately fell on the untouched breakfast tray, and a flicker of annoyance crossed his features. "A hunger strike, Miss Vance?" he asked, his voice laced with a dry, unimpressed irony. How disappointingly theatrical. The sight of him, so calm and unaffected after turning her life upside down, ignited a fire in her chest. "I'm not an animal you can lock up and feed," she shot back, standing to face him, her fists clenched at her sides. "This is kidnapping." "This," he corrected, taking a slow step into the room, "is survival, your survival, a concept you seem to be resisting." He stopped a few feet from her, an impassable wall of wealth and power. "Refusing to eat is a childish gesture. It accomplishes nothing beyond making you weak, and I have no use for a weak liability." "And what about my brother?" she challenged, her voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "You used him to threaten me, to control me. Is that part of your survival plan too, you monster?" The word monster hung in the air between them. It did not seem to affect him at all. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out his phone. With a few taps of his thumb, he turned the screen toward her. It was a photograph, clearly taken that morning from a discreet distance. It showed Leo, wearing his favorite blue raincoat and a backpack almost as big as he was, laughing with a friend as they walked toward the entrance of his school. He was safe. He was happy. He was completely oblivious to the nightmare his sister was living. The fight went out of her in a single, devastating rush. Her shoulders slumped. "I keep my word, Miss Vance," Dante said, his voice low and devoid of any triumph. It was a simple statement of fact. His appointment with Dr. Finch has been scheduled for Thursday. The best care is being arranged. As long as you are cooperative, he will have everything he needs. He will be protected, not just from his illness, but from the consequences of your theatricals. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. The message was crystal clear. Her compliance was the currency that paid for Leo's safety. He walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. "Eat," he commanded, his back to her. "Your defiance is an expensive luxury, and it is your brother who will be forced to pay the price. I will not warn you again." The door closed, and the lock clicked home. Elara stood, frozen, for a long time. The monster had rules, and the first rule was that he always won. She looked from the locked door to the photograph still burned into her memory, Leo, laughing in the rain. With a shaking hand, she walked to the table. She picked up a piece of melon, the fruit cool and sweet against her lips. It tasted like surrender. But as she forced herself to eat, a new, harder feeling began to crystallize in her heart. She would eat. She would stay strong. She would learn the rules of this cage, and she would survive. Not just for Leo, but for the day she could find a way to make the monster pay. The first 3 days of Elara's confinement passed with the suffocating slowness of a fever dream. Her world shrank to the dimensions of the guest suite and the long, sterile hallway that connected it to the main living area. Sophia permitted her to use the living room during the day, a small mercy that felt more like a change of scenery for a zoo animal than a taste of freedom. She would sit on the impossibly expensive leather sofa, the untouched satchel containing the silver music box resting on the glass table like a relic from another life, and stare out at the city that was no longer hers to walk. Dante was a ghost. He was rarely seen, his presence marked only by the low hum of a conversation from a closed office down the hall, or the distant sound of the private elevator arriving and departing at odd hours. Yet, his control was absolute. Every meal arrived on time. A selection of new clothes, simple, elegant, and in her exact size appeared in the closet, a silent, unsettling testament to his thoroughness. He had stripped her of her life, but provided for her physical needs with the detached efficiency of a zookeeper. Elara did not remain idle. She was a restorer, a problem solver. Her mind was trained to see cracks in a facade, to find the hidden weaknesses beneath a perfect surface. She spent hours exploring her gilded cage, running her fingers along the seamless joints of the windows, studying the wiring of the intercom, examining the hinges on every door. It was all flawless, a fortress of modern technology and impenetrable design. Her defiance had not vanished, it had simply gone quiet, turning inward. She spoke only when necessary, her answers to Sophia's occasional questions clipped and polite. She ate every meal, forcing down each bite with the singular thought of maintaining her strength. This was no longer about childish rebellion, it was about strategic survival. She was gathering information, observing routines, waiting for an opportunity. The opportunity, she thought, came on the 4th night. A violent thunderstorm had descended upon Savannah, a furious assault of wind and rain that rattled even the thick ballistic glass of the penthouse. The power flickered twice, and for a blissful second each time, the emergency lights failed to kick in, plunging the apartment into absolute, disorienting darkness. It was a flaw. A tiny, almost insignificant flaw, but the first one she had found. Later that evening, Sophia brought her dinner, and with a slight frown informed her, "Mr. Moretti will be dining out tonight. The storm has caused some minor electrical issues with the building's backup generator. A technician is on site." This was it. A storm. A distraction. Electrical issues. Dante gone. It was a confluence of events that felt like a sign, a crack in the perfect prison walls. She waited for hours, her heart a frantic, hopeful drum in her chest. She watched Sophia perform her evening duties, clearing the dinner tray, turning down the bed. Finally, the housekeeper retreated to her own quarters, and the penthouse fell silent, save for the roar of the storm outside. Elara put her plan into action. Dressed in the dark clothes that had been provided, she slipped out of her room. The main living area was dimly lit, the city lights outside obscured by the sheeting rain. She moved with a stealth she didn't know she possessed, her bare feet silent on the cold marble floor. Her target was the service stairwell. She had noted its location on her first day, a discreet door near the kitchen area. While Dante had said it was alarmed, the electrical issues gave her a sliver of hope. Perhaps the alarm system was compromised. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only one she had. She reached the door, her hand trembling as she touched the cold metal handle. She took a deep breath, braced for the blare of an alarm, and pushed. To her astonishment, the door opened with a soft click. No alarm, no siren, just the muted sound of the wind howling in the concrete stairwell beyond. A giddy, wild hope surged through her. It was working. She slipped through the door, letting it close silently behind her, and was immediately plunged into near-total darkness. The air was cool and smelled of damp concrete. She began her descent, her hand trailing along the rough wall, her steps careful and measured. Floor after floor she moved downward, a ghost escaping a tower. She had descended what felt like 10 floors when a sudden, brilliant light flooded the stairwell from below, blinding her. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. A figure stood at the bottom of the landing, silhouetted against the light. As her eyes adjusted, the silhouette took shape, and her hope turned to ice in her veins. It was Dante. He was not supposed to be here. He was supposed to be out. He stood with his hands in the pockets of his trousers, his suit jacket gone, his white shirt crisp in the harsh light. He wasn't angry. He wasn't surprised. He looked bored, as if he had been waiting for her all along. "An impressive effort, Miss Vance," he said, his voice echoing in the concrete space. "You found a blind spot. The alarm on that door is programmed to deactivate for 30 seconds when the kitchen is in use. Sophia was making tea. Clever." Elara couldn't speak. She was caught. The realization was a physical weight, crushing the air from her lungs. "But you seem to have forgotten my first rule," he continued, taking a slow step up toward her. "Do not test the security. Did you really think I would have only one alarm? The entire stairwell is monitored by pressure plates. I knew you were in here the moment you stepped off the first landing." He stopped on the step just below her, forcing her to look down at him. The height difference was gone, and they were suddenly eye to eye. His presence was overwhelming, a vortex of power and control that seemed to draw all the air from the stairwell. "The dinner engagement was a fiction," he explained, his voice a low, chilling whisper. "The electrical issues were a test. I wanted to see what you would do. I needed to know if you were a foolish lamb or something more." He tilted his head, his gray eyes pinning her in place. "You are more, which makes you far more dangerous and far more disappointing." He reached out, his hand closing around her upper arm. His grip was firm, inescapable. "Let's go back upstairs. Your lesson in futility is now over." Dante did not speak again as he led her back to the elevator. His grip on her arm was a manacle of warm steel, firm and inescapable, a constant reminder of her failure. The ride up was suffocatingly silent, the soft hum of the machinery a stark contrast to the frantic pounding of Elara's own heart. Humiliation burned in her cheeks. She hadn't just been caught, she had been played, every move anticipated and countered by a master strategist. She had been the mouse, and he had simply been waiting to see which way she would run. When the elevator doors opened into the penthouse, he finally released her. The storm had begun to break, its fury abating into a steady, soft rain. Through a gap in the dark, retreating clouds, a full moon appeared, casting a brilliant, silvery light through the massive wall of glass. The apartment, once sterile and cold, was now bathed in a soft, ethereal glow, transforming the marble floors into a tranquil, moonlit lake. Elara didn't move. She stood in the center of the room, trembling with a volatile mixture of anger and despair. All her planning, her hope, her small act of rebellion, it had all been for nothing. A dry, humorless sob escaped her lips. "What do you want from me?" she finally whispered, her voice cracking. When he didn't answer, she turned on him, the last of her composure shattering. "Why are you doing this? Was that the point? To humiliate me? To prove how much power you have?" Her voice grew louder, fueled by the injustice of it all. "Am I supposed to just sit here? Be your perfect, quiet little prisoner until you get bored? What happens then, huh? Do you just get rid of the liability?" She was raw, exposed, all her carefully constructed walls of defiance torn down. She expected him to be angry, to dismiss her with a cold command. She expected the monster. But Dante did not respond with anger. He simply watched her, his expression shadowed and unreadable in the moonlight. Her raw, broken words seemed to breach a defense he hadn't even known was there. For a moment, he looked less like a captor and more like a man hearing a language he had long forgotten. He turned away from her and walked toward the immense window, his silhouette a stark, dark figure against the luminous cityscape. He stood there for a long time, his back to her, watching the last of the storm clouds drift over Savannah. "In my world, Miss Vance," he said finally, his voice unexpectedly quiet, almost reflective, "there are no second chances. There is no benefit of the doubt. There are only assets and threats, variables to be controlled." He paused, his gaze fixed on the distant, dark ribbon of the river. "Years ago, my family was destroyed because my father chose to trust someone. He believed in loyalty. He believed in friendship. That belief cost him his life, and the life of his daughter, my sister. Elara's breath hitched. It was the first time he had mentioned his past, the first crack in the marble facade. He was a good man, Dante continued, a bitter edge to his tone. And he was a fool. I learned from his mistake. I learned that control is the only thing that is real. Every possibility must be anticipated. Every variable must be tested. He turned his head slightly, his profile etched by the moonlight. Tonight, you were an untested variable. Now I know what you are. He fell silent again, and in that silence, Elara saw him. For the first time, she saw past the ruthless crime boss, the cold-hearted captor. She saw a man standing in a cage of his own making, a fortress built of wealth and power, but a prison nonetheless, a prison built to keep the ghosts of his past at bay. She saw the profound, crushing loneliness of a man who could trust no one. The moonlight streamed between them, a silent, silver bridge. The anger in her chest didn't vanish, but it was joined by a new, unwelcome emotion. It was a flicker of understanding, a startling pang of empathy for the broken boy who had been forced to become a monster to survive. The moment stretched, fragile and surreal, before he broke it. He turned fully from the window, and the mask of cold authority was back in place, his face once more a carefully composed study in control. The brief glimpse of the man behind it was gone. "You will not try to escape again," he said. It was not a threat this time, but a simple statement of a truth they both now understood. She wouldn't try, not because she was afraid of the consequences for herself, but because she now understood the deadly seriousness of the game she was in. "Go to your room," he ordered, his voice back to its usual commanding tone. "Sophia will bring you something to help you sleep." He dismissed her as if she were a subordinate, the strange intimacy of the last few minutes erased. Elara didn't argue. Numbly, she turned and walked back to her suite, the gilded cage that was her room. As the door clicked shut behind her, she was left with a dizzying swirl of emotions. She still hated him for what he was doing to her, for trapping her and using her brother. But now, that hatred was tainted with something else, something far more complicated. She had seen the man behind the monster, and she didn't know which one was more dangerous. In the days following her failed escape, a strange and tense quiet settled over the penthouse. The dynamic between Elara and her captor had shifted into an unspoken truce. He no longer treated her as a variable to be tested, and she no longer viewed him as a monolith of pure evil. The monster now had ghosts, and his prisoner had a spirit he was beginning to recognize. Dante became a more frequent, if distant, presence. He would work for hours in his office, the door sometimes left slightly ajar, allowing the low murmur of his voice on a business call to drift into the living area. Elara would sit with a book she had no interest in reading, acutely aware of his proximity. His brooding, silent energy filled the space, a constant, low-grade hum of danger and authority. She, in turn, was a foreign element in his sterile world, a splash of unwanted color, a flicker of defiant life that refused to be assimilated into the gray and black decor. But survival was not the same as living. Elara's mind, accustomed to the intricate challenges of her craft, began to atrophy in the luxurious emptiness. The boredom was a physical thing, a heavy cloak that smothered her thoughts. She felt her sharp edges growing dull, her resilience fraying. She needed a problem to solve, a purpose beyond waiting. Dante noticed. He was a man who missed nothing, and he saw the listlessness that had replaced her fiery defiance. He knew that a sharp mind, left to idle, would inevitably turn to plotting. A busy captive was a manageable one. One afternoon, he emerged from his office and found her standing at the window, her forehead pressed against the glass. "Your talents are being wasted," he stated, his voice making her jump. She turned to face him, her expression guarded. "My talents are none of your concern." "On the contrary," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "Your current state of mind has become my concern. Come with me." Wary, but with little choice, she followed him to a section of the penthouse she hadn't seen. He pressed his thumb to a panel on a seemingly blank wall, and a door slid open, revealing a climate-controlled storage room. It was less sterile than the rest of the apartment, filled with a few carefully stored pieces of antique furniture and several large canvas-wrapped rectangles leaning against the wall. He walked to the largest one. "I have a project for you," he said, pulling away the heavy canvas drop cloth. Elara's breath caught. It was a large oil portrait, at least a century old, and in a terrible state of disrepair. The varnish had yellowed to a dark, ugly brown, obscuring the colors beneath. A long, jagged tear ran through the lower left corner, and the entire surface was webbed with a fine mesh of craquelure. It was a restorer's nightmare, and a tantalizing challenge. The portrait depicted a stately, beautiful woman with kind eyes, seated in a chair. Standing beside her were two children. One was a young boy, no older than 10, with a serious expression and familiar, piercing gray eyes. The other was a little girl, a few years younger, with a bright, mischievous smile and dark, curly hair. Despite the damage, the love between the three subjects was palpable, a warmth that seemed to radiate from beneath the layers of grime and time. "It was damaged in a fire many years ago," Dante said, his voice carefully neutral. "I want it restored." Elara stared at the painting, her professional instincts overriding her resentment. "This is a massive undertaking. It would require specialized solvents, conservation-grade pigments, tools." "They are already here," he interrupted, gesturing to a large professional-grade work cabinet in the corner of the room. "Everything you could possibly need has been procured, the best available." She looked from the cabinet to him, her suspicion returning. Why? Why should I do anything for you? This painting, it's of your family, isn't it?" His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. It was the boy in the painting, and the little girl, his sister. "It is a piece of my family's history that was left broken," he said, his voice cold and clipped. "I do not tolerate broken things in my house. I am not asking for a favor, Miss Vance. I am offering you an alternative to staring at walls and plotting futile escapes. Your mind requires a puzzle. Here is one." It was a command disguised as an offer, a shrewd appeal to the very core of who she was. He was right. The sight of the damaged canvas made her fingers itch. The challenge called to her, a siren song for her idle hands and mind, to bring this beautiful piece back from the brink of oblivion. It was a chance to create, to mend, to do the one thing she was best at. It was a lifeline, but she would not give him the satisfaction of a simple surrender. She met his gaze, her own chin held high. "I won't do it for you," she said, her voice firm. "I'll do it because a work of art this beautiful doesn't deserve to be forgotten. I'm doing this for the painting, and for my own sanity." Nothing more. A long, silent moment passed between them. A hint of something not quite a smile, but a shadow of acknowledgement touched his lips. "Your motivation is irrelevant to me. Only the result matters." He left her there. The door slid shut, leaving her alone with the ghosts on the canvas. Later that day, a corner of the vast living room had been transformed. An easel stood bathed in the natural light from the window, the large portrait resting upon it. On a long table beside it, the tools of her trade were laid out with surgical precision. For the first time since that rainy night on River Street, Elara felt a spark of her old self return. She stood before the canvas, studying the serious boy with the hauntingly familiar eyes. As she gently touched the edge of the tear near the little girl's smiling face, she knew this was more than just a job to keep her busy. She had been tasked with restoring Dante Moretti's past, and she had a chilling premonition that in doing so, she would uncover secrets that were meant to stay buried forever. The restoration of the portrait became Elara's sanctuary. In the world of solvents, pigments, and meticulous focus, she could momentarily forget the invisible bars of her gilded cage. She spent hours each day before the canvas, her presence transforming a corner of the cold penthouse into a living art studio. The scent of turpentine and linseed oil began to overpower the synthetic fragrance of the perfectly arranged flowers Sophia replaced each morning. She began the painstaking work of cleaning. With infinite patience, she used small cotton swabs dipped in a special solvent to slowly lift away the centuries-old yellowed varnish. Bit by bit, like an archaeologist unearthing a forgotten treasure, the true colors of the painting began to emerge. The deep sapphire of the woman's dress, the warm cream of her skin, and the vibrant auburn in the little girl's hair. It was a slow, meditative process, and Elara lost herself in it completely. Dante became a silent observer. He would stand at the far side of the room, leaning against the doorframe of his office with his arms crossed, and simply watch her work. He said nothing, offered no advice, but his presence was a tangible pressure. Elara could feel his eyes on her back, an intense scrutiny that was both unnerving and, strangely, validating. He watched the way her hands moved with confidence and delicacy, the way she would bite her lower lip in concentration over a particularly difficult detail. He saw the way the light from the window caught the honey-colored strands of her hair and the way she seemed to forget him, forget her circumstances, completely lost in her craft. In those moments, she was not his prisoner. She was an artist, a healer, someone who could bring life back to what was lost. And that, in some inexplicable way, was both fascinating and dangerous to him. One afternoon, as she was carefully mending the tear in the canvas. Their fragile peace was shattered. Luca, Dante's loyal driver and bodyguard, entered the penthouse. His normally stoic expression was tight. He carried a small, unmarked cardboard box, wrapped in simple brown paper. "Sir," Luca said, his voice low and alert. "This was left at the service entrance. The courier was gone before security could approach." Dante pushed away from his observation post and took the box from Luca. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The former tense quiet was now heavy with a real and present threat. Elara stopped her work, her tiny brush hovering over the canvas, her full attention on the mysterious package. With sharp, economical movements, Dante placed the box on the glass coffee table. Luca stood nearby, his right hand resting casually inside his jacket, near where Elara guessed a gun would be. Dante used a letter opener from a desk drawer to carefully slice the tape and open the lid. Elara held her breath. Inside, resting on a bed of black cloth, was a dead raven. Its iridescent feathers were ruffled, and its black bead-like eyes were vacant and dull. But that wasn't what made the blood in Elara's veins run cold. Tied around one of the bird's legs was a thin, sky-blue silk ribbon. It was a ribbon from one of the silk nightgowns Sophia had laid out for her. Time seemed to stop. Elara stared at the ribbon, a personal, intimate item, now sullied by death and menace. The Rooks. They didn't just know Dante was hiding a woman, they knew a piece of her. They had been close enough to get it. Dante didn't look at her. His gaze was steel-cold, fixed on the dead bird. But she saw the muscle in his jaw clench, a single nerve twitching beneath the skin. The monster she had momentarily forgotten was now wide awake. "They're sending a message," Luca rumbled, his voice thick with anger. "They're getting bold." "No," Dante said, his voice dangerously soft. "They're not getting bold. They're making a mistake." He carefully closed the lid on the box, his movements precise and controlled, but Elara could feel the rage simmering just beneath the surface. The false peace was broken. The relative safety of this gilded cage had been exposed as an illusion. The enemy wasn't just outside these walls. They had found a way in, a way to touch her world. Dante finally looked up and met her gaze. His eyes held no trace of the silent observer or the reluctant admirer. They were chips of ice, filled with a ruthless resolve. "Your work is done for today," he commanded. "Go to your room. Stay there until I tell you otherwise." The warning hadn't just been for him. It was for her, too. The Rooks had just elevated her from an unfortunate bystander to a pawn in their deadly game. And as Elara turned to go, she knew one thing for certain. The protective walls Dante had built around her had just gotten much higher and infinitely colder. The aftermath of the Rook's warning was a cold, sterile silence that descended upon the penthouse. Dante had ordered a complete lockdown. Sophia now moved through the rooms with the quietness of a phantom, her watchful eyes constantly scanning the corners. Elara was confined to her suite, the door always closed. The restoration of the portrait was indefinitely suspended. Her gilded cage had shrunk to a cramped box. Through the door she could hear snippets of conversation. Dante's low, tense voice and Luca's clipped responses. There were urgent phone calls, made in rapid, aggressive Italian that sounded like metal, striking metal. He was hunting. The cold fury she had seen in his eyes was now unleashed upon the world outside these walls. Fear gnawed at Elara, a constant chill in her chest. The image of the blue ribbon tied to the dead raven's leg haunted her. But beneath the fear, another emotion was stirring. Frustration. Dante was treating her like a precious but problematic piece of porcelain, an object to be stored away and protected. He had stripped her of even the illusion of agency the restoration work had provided. On the second night after the incident, she couldn't stand it anymore. It was nearly midnight, and she knew Dante was still awake. She hadn't seen him since he'd ordered her to her room, but she could feel his presence like a storm brewing just outside her door. Defying his orders, she opened her door and slipped out. The penthouse was dark, save for a single sliver of light coming from beneath his slightly ajar office door. Driven by an impulse she didn't fully understand, she went to the kitchen. She brewed a cup of chamomile tea, its gentle scent a stark contradiction to the tension that saturated the air. With her heart pounding, she carried the cup to the office and knocked softly on the open door. "I said to leave me alone, Sophia." His voice came, tired and sharp. "It's not Sophia," she said quietly, and pushed the door open. Dante's office was the command center of a war. Maps of Savannah were spread across his massive desk, marked with red pins. Surveillance photos of unknown faces were tacked to a board. The space was charged with the tense energy of a cornered predator. He was standing by the window, his back to her, One hand braced against the glass. He had shed his suit jacket and tie, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled up to his forearms. Even from behind, she could see the strain in his shoulders, the exhaustion in his posture. "I gave you an order to stay in your room," he said without turning. "I'm not one of your soldiers to command, Dante," she replied, her voice shaky but firm. "And you look like you're about to collapse." She placed the tea on a clear corner of his desk. That's when she noticed it. His right hand, the one braced against the window, was crudely wrapped in a white handkerchief, and seeping through the fabric was a dark, crimson stain. "You're hurt," she blurted out. "It's none of your concern," he shot back. "Let me see," she said, stepping closer. "Don't," he warned, his voice a low growl. But Elara ignored him. She was no longer afraid of his anger. Right now, he wasn't a monster. He was a man, bleeding, trying to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. She gently touched his arm. "Please." Her touch seemed to break something in him. The resistance went out of him. He slowly turned to face her, and in the dim light of the desk lamp, she saw the sheer exhaustion etched onto his face. There were dark circles under his eyes, and the scar on his eyebrow seemed more prominent. He reluctantly held out his injured hand. She carefully unwrapped the blood-stiffened handkerchief. Beneath was a deep, jagged cut across his knuckles, a clear wound from a violent confrontation. It had been wiped, but not properly cleaned. Without a word, she led him to the private bathroom adjoining the office. She found a first aid kit and gently sat him down on the edge of the marble bathtub. Under the harsh bathroom lights, she began to clean the wound. Dante was rigid under her touch, unused to such gentleness. He was accustomed to violence, to cold transactions, and to stark isolation. But this simple act of care, the warmth of her fingers, the soft concentration on her face, her touch that asked for nothing in return, was entirely foreign territory. As she disinfected the cut, he hissed softly, and she looked up, their eyes meeting. The room seemed to shrink. The world outside the rooks, the threats, the war vanished. There was only the two of them, there in the brightly lit, intimate space. She could see other, fainter scars on his hands, the pale ghosts of a violent life. She saw the vulnerability beneath his steel armor. He watched her, not as a prisoner or an asset, but as a woman. A woman who had defied him, challenged him, and was now tending to his wounds with a tenderness he didn't think existed anymore. She finished by wrapping a clean bandage around his knuckles. Her hands lingered on his for a fraction of a second too long. The air between them was thick with things unsaid. She finally pulled her hands away, breaking the spell. "There," she said softly. He didn't say thank you. But as he looked at his bandaged hand and then back up at her, she saw something in his eyes, a flicker of silent gratitude, an acknowledgement of an unspoken debt. The moment of tenderness had passed, but it had left its mark. It had tightened an invisible thread between captor and captive, a thread woven from shared vulnerability and unexpected care, making their complicated relationship more dangerous than ever. The atmosphere in the penthouse had changed after the night Elara tended to Dante's hand. The tension was still there, an ever-present undercurrent, but it was colored by something new. A quiet intimacy now existed between them, an acknowledgement of the shared moment of vulnerability that had breached the rigid boundaries of captor and captive. Dante became less distant. While he maintained his cold exterior, she began to notice small shifts. He would occasionally linger in the living area while she was there, saying nothing, simply sharing the space. He left a stack of art history books on the coffee table for her, volumes he must have had specifically requested. They were small, unspoken gestures, but they spoke volumes. On the second morning after the incident, he walked into the living room where she was sitting and said, "You should resume your work." Elara looked up at him, surprised. "With the portrait?" He nodded. "The immediate threat has been contained, and I believe it is no longer wise to let your talents go to waste." It was a concession, a sign of trust. But Elara also understood the subtext. It was a way to keep her occupied and in his sight. Still, she felt a wave of relief. She longed to return to the work, to the purpose it gave her. She threw herself into the restoration with a renewed focus. The unexpected moment of tenderness she had shared with Dante had deepened her connection to the painting. Now, when she looked at the face of the serious young boy, she saw more than just a younger version of her captor. She saw a boy who had lost his sister's smile and his mother's warmth, a boy who had been shaped by his past into the man he had become. She had successfully cleaned most of the surface, revealing the brilliant colors and the artist's delicate brushwork. Now, She turned her attention to the bottom right corner of the painting, an area that was heavily damaged not just by the tear she had mended, but by a dark, thick patch of paint that didn't seem to belong with the rest of the piece. It looked like a clumsy repair attempt from years ago, a crude slab of oil paint obscuring whatever lay beneath. As she began the careful process of removing this overpaint, she noticed something strange. The solvents reacted differently to this layer than they had to the rest of the painting. The texture beneath was different, and there was an inconsistency in how the paint adhered to the canvas primer. Her professional instincts flared. This wasn't a random repair. It was deliberate. Someone had intentionally hidden something. Her heart began to beat a little faster. Driven by curiosity and a vague sense that this was important, she worked with the precision of a surgeon. Millimeter by millimeter, she gently dissolved the dark overpaint, blotting it away with tiny cotton swabs. It was a task that required patience and a steady hand. Dante entered the room, his voice making her jump. "What have you found?" She had been so engrossed in her work she hadn't heard him approach. She looked up to see him standing directly behind her, looking over her shoulder at the canvas. She could feel the warmth radiating off him, and the subtle scent of expensive cologne and ozone. "I'm not sure," she whispered, the familiar eye slipping out naturally. "There's a layer of overpaint here. It's not original. Someone painted on top of it." His attention was fully on the painting. She saw an intense gleam in his eyes. What were they hiding? "I'm about to find out," she said. With the utmost care, she used a small tool to flake away the last of the loosened paint from a small section. Beneath the dark oil paint was not the expected continuation of the floorboards or rug. Instead, there was writing, faded black ink in the elegant loops and curves of a cursive hand. She could only make out a few words, but they were enough to send a chill through her. "Safe with me. Forgive my cowardice." And below the words, a partially obscured part of a signature. The first letter was a flourishing, capital T, and the last was an T-N. It wasn't the signature of the artist who had painted the portrait, whose work she had studied. It was something else, a secret message, a confession, buried under oil paint for decades. Elara took a step back from the canvas, her sense of discovery quickly being replaced by a sense of dread. This was no longer an art restoration project. She had just unearthed a secret from the grave of the Moretti family's past. And as she looked at Dante's hardened, incredulous face, she knew that this secret had the power to destroy everything. Chapter 12. The Signature of the Past. The silence in the penthouse became heavy, almost unbreathable. The hidden words on the canvas seemed to emit a chill that permeated the room. Elara could feel Dante's gaze fixed on her, intense and searching, as if he were trying to will the answers out of her mind. "Tell me what it means," he commanded, his voice low and dangerous. All traces of their quiet intimacy were gone. The monster was back, awakened by the ghosts of his past. "I don't know," Elara answered, her own voice trembling. This isn't the artist's signature. The hand is completely different. The ink is wrong. It looks like someone added it later, just before it was painted over." "Who?" he pressed, stepping closer, his presence crowding her. "Whose signature is it?" "I can't tell unless I uncover more," she said, trying to keep her tone steady and professional, clinging to the logic of her work like a life raft in the storm of his emotion. "It's delicate. I have to go slowly, or the ink could be destroyed by the solvent." Dante stared at her for a long moment, an internal war playing out in his gray eyes. His impatience was battling with his need to know the truth. Finally, he gave a single, sharp nod. "Do it." With her heart hammering against her ribs, Elara returned to her work. But now, it no longer felt like a restoration. It felt like an autopsy. She felt as if she were cutting into the secret heart of his family's history, and she had no idea if the patient would survive. Dante did not leave. He pulled a chair over, sat, and watched her every move. His silence was a weight, a constant reminder of the importance of what she was about to find. The minutes crawled by like hours. Elara worked with intense concentration, the world narrowing to the tiny patch of canvas under her hands. Little by little, she revealed more of the script. To Isabella and her beloved son and daughter, "This will reach you as a reminder of what was taken. Keep it safe. What I saw that night. God, trust that the boy will grow strong. It is safe with me. Forgive my cowardice." It was a missive, a confession, a warning all in one. It was addressed to his grandmother Isabella. The woman he had once mentioned had raised him after the fire. Finally, Elara reached the signature. She held her breath, her hand miraculously steady as she gently blotted away the last flecks of overpaint. The flourishing capital T, followed by an H-O-M-P-S-O, and ending with the N. Thompson. The name emerged, clear and undeniable, upon the canvas. Elara stared at it, her brain refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. Thompson. It wasn't just any name. It was her name, and the handwriting, elegant, leaning slightly to the right, with that distinctively looped T. She had seen it 1,000 times on old letters and the back of childhood sketches. It was the signature of her grandfather, Arthur Thompson, a talented but little-known painter who had died when she was a child, leaving her with a love of art and a last name she had always carried with pride. A wave of vertigo washed over her. The air seemed to thicken, and she had to brace a hand against the easel to steady herself. This painting, this letter, her grandfather's decades of silence about his past, all the disparate, frayed threads of her life were suddenly flying together, forming a horrifying, impossible tapestry. What does it say? Dante's voice sliced through the silence, sharp as a razor's edge. The signature. Who is it? Elara slowly turned to face him. She must have looked like a ghost, her face drained of all color. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She tried a second time, and the name escaped as a raw, ragged whisper, a confession that would change everything, forever. Thompson, she said. The signature is Arthur Thompson, my grandfather. The name Thompson hung in the air between them, as heavy and cold as a tombstone. For a long, stretched moment, Dante just stared at her, his face an impenetrable mask. The initial disbelief in his eyes quickly hardened into something colder, far more dangerous. Ice, sharp suspicion. The walls he had begun to lower around her were now back up, higher and reinforced with the pain of an old betrayal. You're lying, he hissed, the words lashing out like a whip. I'm not, Elara countered, panic making her voice high. Arthur Thompson was my grandfather. He was a painter. He died when I was little. I didn't know any of this. I swear. What a convenient coincidence, Dante sneered, a cold, cruel smile twisting his lips. Of all the art restorers in Savannah, the one who happens to stumble into my car is the granddaughter of the man whose signature is hidden in my family's buried history. He advanced on her, invading her space, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Tell me, Elara, was it all a performance? Was your mistake part of a larger plan? Has your family been waiting for years to work someone into my life? His accusations were vicious and irrational, born of pain and paranoia, but they hit her with the force of a physical blow. No, she cried, stumbling back from him. You're insane. My grandfather was a kind, quiet man he would never have been a part of, whatever your world is. That letter, it says he was scared. It says he was a coward. It doesn't say he was a criminal. Cowardice and betrayal are two sides of the same coin, Dante said harshly. He was there. He saw what happened. And he ran. The certainty in his voice stopped her cold. Where? Where was my grandfather? Without another word, Dante seized her arm this time with none of his recent gentleness and pulled her from the living room and into his office. He released her and stalked to a safe hidden behind a painting on the wall. He opened it and retrieved a thin, aging file folder. He threw it onto the ebony desk. This is the police file on the fire that killed my father and my sister. It was closed years ago for lack of evidence. Her hand trembling, Elara looked at the folder. That night, Dante began, his voice flat and emotionless, as if he were reciting a story about someone else. My father had invited a painter to our home. A little-known but talented local artist my mother admired. His name was Arthur Thompson. Elara's heart stopped. He was commissioned to discuss a new family portrait. According to the official report, he arrived just before the attack began. He was the only non-family member present. When the attacker's men we later learned belonged to a rival family, backed by a traitor within our own organization, stormed the house, Mr. Thompson supposedly hid in a coat closet. He was there, listening to everything. The gunshots. My mother's screams as she tried to protect us. My sister's. His voice broke for an almost imperceptible moment before he mastered it, the ice returning. When it was over and the house was set on fire, he fled. He never went to the police. He never spoke of what he saw. To the world, he was just a lucky witness who escaped. But to me, Dante said, his gray eyes locking on hers, he was the coward who could have identified the men who destroyed my family, but chose to save himself instead. He gestured back toward the portrait in the other room. That painting must have been a gift of guilt, sent to my grandmother with the cowardly apology he was too afraid to deliver himself. He hid behind oil paint, just like he hid in a closet that night. Elara finally understood. The weight of contempt Dante had carried for years for this anonymous man now had a face, and it was her grandfather's. That hatred was now transferred to her, the descendant of the man he saw as a coward. The fragile trust they had built, the quiet moments, the unexpected tenderness, the reluctant respect, it all turned to ash. They were no longer simply captor and captive. They were the living embodiment of an old tragedy, two souls bound by the same fateful night, but standing on opposite sides of a chasm of pain and accusation. And Elara realized, with a horrifying clarity, that she was no longer just a prisoner in his house. She had become a prisoner of his history. For the next few days, a frost settled over the penthouse, harsher than any silence that had come before. Dante and Elara moved like two planets in separate orbits, forced to share the same universe but separated by a void of suspicion and painful history. The portrait sat on its easel, its revealed secret an open wound in the room. Elara was once again confined, but this time it felt different. It was no longer protective custody, it was quarantine. She could feel the weight of Dante's suspicion on her, an invisible pressure that made it hard to breathe. She was torn between two images. One was her faint memory of a gentle grandfather who smelled of oil paints and had a kind smile. The other was the picture Dante had painted, a coward, hiding in the dark while a family was slaughtered. The two could not coexist, and the contradiction gnawed at her. Dante, meanwhile, became a ghost. He was completely consumed, his phone calls becoming sharper, his nights longer. He was digging into the past, Elara knew. He was looking for a connection, for proof that her presence in his life was anything but random. Every meal Sophia brought felt like an interrogation. Every brief glance from the housekeeper seemed accusatory. But Elara was not one to passively accept her fate. After 3 days of the agonizing silence, she realized she couldn't let Dante's version of the story be the only truth. She owed it to her grandfather, and she owed it to herself, to find out more. She left her suite and found Dante in his office. He looked up as she entered, his eyes cold and wary. "I need to see the painting again," she said, her voice devoid of hesitation. He studied her for a long moment, assessing her. "Why?" "Because I don't believe my grandfather was a coward," she said simply. "And I won't stand by while you convict him." Something in her defiance seemed to register with him. Perhaps he saw a reflection of his own determination in her eyes. After a moment of silence, he stood and led her out to the living room. She stood before the painting, but this time she looked at it with a different purpose. She reread the hidden letter, the words now seared into her mind. What I saw that night. "Forgive my cowardice. Everyone assumes his cowardice was running away," Elara said softly, almost to herself. But what if it wasn't? What if his cowardice was staying silent? Dante stood with his arms crossed, his expression skeptical. "It's the same thing." "It's not," Elara said, turning to face him, a wild idea beginning to form in her mind. Running is an instinct. Silence is a choice. Why would a man choose silence when he could identify murderers? Maybe it wasn't the attackers he was afraid of. She pointed to the painting. "This letter isn't just an apology. It's a warning. Keep it safe." He wasn't just talking about the painting. He was talking about your remaining family, your grandmother, and you. He was afraid for their safety. She moved closer to him, her eyes alight with a new conviction. "You said there was a traitor in your father's organization. What if the attackers from the rival family weren't the biggest threat that night? What if my grandfather saw not only the killers, but the man who sent them? What if he saw the face of the traitor?" Silence filled the room. Her theory hung in the air, a stunning possibility that Dante had clearly never considered. He had always focused on the external enemy, the Rooks and their predecessors. He'd never thought that the only witness might have known about the rot inside. If he had spoken, Elara pressed on, her voice gaining strength. That traitor, someone in a position of power, someone your father trusted, wouldn't have just killed him. He would have hunted down anyone left who could be a threat. Your grandmother, you. My grandfather's silence may not have been an act of cowardice. It could have been a sacrifice. He chose to carry the burden of silence to keep what was left of your family alive. Dante stared at her, his face a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. The narrative he had believed for nearly 2 decades, the bedrock of his hatred and revenge, had just been shaken to its core. Elara's theory offered an explanation for something that had always bothered him. Why would a man risk sending such a valuable gift to his grandmother instead of simply disappearing forever? He didn't agree. He didn't concede that she might be right. But he didn't deny it, either. He just stood there, his sharp mind clearly reprocessing the tragedy of his life through an entirely new lens. For the first time since the revelation, they were not enemies divided by the past. Instead, a thin, unexpected thread of common purpose had formed between them. They both wanted the full truth of what happened on that fateful night. They had become unexpected allies, bound together by an old signature and a mystery buried under paint, and they both knew that unearthing that truth could be far more dangerous than letting it lie. The shift in the penthouse was almost tangible. The coldness of suspicion had evaporated, replaced by a new, tense, and focused energy. Elara and Dante were a team now, connected by a singular goal, to unearth the truth that had been buried for nearly 2 decades. The penthouse was no longer a prison, but a war room, and the family portrait was their first map. If my grandfather knew the traitor's face, Elara reasoned one morning, as they stood before the canvas, he wouldn't have written down his name. It would have been too dangerous. But he was an artist. It's how he saw the world. Through images, not words. If there's another clue, it won't be written. It will be drawn. Dante nodded, following her logic. His belongings, his sketchbooks, his journals. Where are they? In an old trunk in the attic of my house, she replied. Then a knot of anxiety formed. But my brother is there. He's being looked after by an elderly neighbor. We can't. We won't do anything, Dante interrupted, his cool confidence returning. I'll handle it. He handled it with ruthless and untraceable efficiency. 2 days later, a team of electrical inspectors arrived at Elara's home, informing the neighbor of an emergency wiring upgrade that required access to the attic. Less than an hour after that, Luca arrived at the penthouse door, not with a box, but with a dusty old wooden trunk that smelled of mothballs and time. They opened it together on the living room floor. It felt strange, unexpectedly intimate, to sift through the remains of a man's life together. The trunk was filled with old art supplies, hardened tubes of paint, and stacks of sketchbooks tied with twine. For hours they went through each book. Most were filled with beautiful but irrelevant images, sketches of Savannah's squares, studies of Spanish moss dripping from oaks, quick portraits of strangers on park benches. It was the life of a quiet artist, with no hint of the darkness he had witnessed. Disappointment began to set in. Maybe we were wrong, Elara said softly, flipping through the last pages of a thick book. No, Dante said, his voice firm. He was examining a thinner, leather-bound volume. The dates. In the corner. This one is from that year. Elara's heart beat faster as he handed it to her. The first pages were filled with preliminary studies of hands and faces, clearly commissioned work. But as she flipped toward the back, the drawings became hastier, almost frantic. There were repeated sketches of a dark hallway, a slightly ajar closet door. They were images from her grandfather's tortured memory. And then, she found it. Tucked into a small leather pocket on the inside back cover was a single yellowed sheet of charcoal paper. It was not a scene, it was a portrait. A preliminary sketch of a middle-aged man with a broad jaw, slicked back hair, and cunning eyes that seemed to stare right at her. But it wasn't the man that made Elara catch her breath. It was the background. Sketched faintly behind him was the top of an elaborately carved marble fireplace. That fireplace, Dante whispered, his voice tight. It was in my father's study, at the old house. Her grandfather had placed the traitor at the scene of the crime. And there was one final detail. In the bottom right-hand corner of the sketch, next to her grandfather's familiar AT initial, was a tiny, almost unnoticeable drawing. A symbol. The head of a bird, with a distinctive, curved beak. The head of a rook. Elara looked up at Dante, her eyes wide with horror and understanding. The rooks. But Dante was no longer looking at the symbol. He was staring at the face of the man in the drawing, and Dante's own face was a mask of recognition and pure, undiluted hatred. His cool composure had shattered, revealing the raw rage beneath. Marco, he hissed, the name like a curse. My father's consigliere. The man my father loved like a brother. The truth slammed into Elara with the force of a physical blow. The Rooks weren't an old rival family. They were a faction born from betrayal. Where is he now? Elara asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. He's dead, Dante said, his voice like ice, though his eyes still burned. Supposedly died in the fire with my father. He was remembered as a loyal victim. Then he looked up at her, a deadly clarity in his gaze. But his son, Lorenzo, is very much alive, and he is my most trusted advisor. They had found their ghost. Elara's grandfather hadn't written a name. He had left them a face. And that face belonged to the father of the snake Dante had kept by his side for years. The enemy wasn't at the gates. He had been inside the walls all along. The penthouse seemed to shrink, the air thick with the weight of betrayal. The name Lorenzo hung between them, more venomous than that of his father Marco. Marco was a ghost. Lorenzo was a tangible threat, a viper Dante had nurtured at the very heart of his power. Elara expected an explosion. She expected Dante to overturn tables, to shatter glass, to roar commands to his men. Instead, a terrifying stillness settled over him. The fiery rage in his eyes cooled, freezing into something colder, more focused, and infinitely more lethal. He became the Basilisk. All emotion was stripped from his face, leaving only a singular, deadly concentration. "You have to do something," Elara whispered, his silence more frightening than any rage. "Oh, I will," Dante said, his voice dangerously low and even, but not in the way he expects. He began to pace the room, not with anxious energy, but with the controlled power of a stalking panther. "Lorenzo is more than my advisor. He has been by my side since after the fire. He has played the part of a fellow orphan, bound to me by shared tragedy. He has earned the loyalty of many of my men, who see him as the voice of reason, a counterbalance to my ruthlessness." He stopped and faced Elara, a bitter understanding dawning in his eyes. It was all a performance. Every piece of advice, every warning, he has been playing the long game. He doesn't just want revenge, he wants it all. He wants my father's empire, the one his father failed to take. "Then tell your men the truth," Elara urged. "Show them this sketch, and have it be the word of a dead painter and a woman I'm holding captive against my most trusted man?" Dante shot back with a humorless, bitter smile. "It would split the wardens, a civil war. That's exactly what he wants. He would play the part of the wrongly accused victim, and in the chaos he would seize control. No, we cannot show him our hand." He looked at the sketch again, then at Elara, and she saw a shift in his eyes. He was no longer looking at her as a prisoner or a reluctant ally. He was looking at her as a strategic asset. "We are not going to expose him," Dante said, a plan beginning to form in his voice. "We are going to make him expose himself." For the next hour, they laid a plan. For the first time, Dante treated her as an equal, listening to her input, valuing her observations. Elara, with her restorer's eye for detail, saw things he might have missed. "He thinks you know nothing," she said, "and he believes his most valuable piece on the board is me. He sent the Raven to prove he could get to me, to destabilize you, to make you make a mistake in protecting me. A mistake he has gravely underestimated," Dante said, a dangerous glint in his eye. Their plan was audacious and fraught with risk. They would use Elara herself as the bait. Dante would stage a massive, furious argument with Lorenzo. He would accuse Lorenzo of negligence, of allowing the threat of the Raven to happen. He would appear paranoid and unhinged, obsessed with protecting his new asset Elara. "I will be moving you to a new safe house," Dante explained. "A place where only I and my most trusted inner circle know the location. I will make sure Lorenzo knows that I trust him to personally oversee the security. And he'll see it as his chance," Elara finished, her heart pounding at the danger of it all. "To eliminate me, to get rid of your weakness, and maybe you as well, all in one go." "Precisely," Dante affirmed. "He will not be able to resist the opportunity to finish things himself. And when he makes his move, my men, the ones I truly trust, will be there to witness his betrayal with their own eyes." It was a deadly gambit, putting both their lives on the line, banking on Dante's ability to play the part of an unraveling tyrant, and on Lorenzo's ability to be blinded by his own hubris. Late that evening, the plan was set in motion. Dante made the first call, summoning Lorenzo to the penthouse on the pretext of an emergency security breach. His voice over the phone was cold and laced with fury, a perfect performance. As they waited for the traitor to arrive, Elara watched Dante. The lethal stillness had returned, but this time she understood it. It was not an absence of emotion, it was absolute focus. He was sharpening his blade for the final strike. The traitor was about to reveal himself, and the trap was set. Lorenzo arrived within 20 minutes. Elara watched from the darkened hallway, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. He did not look like a shadowy villain. He was tall, charismatic, with a warm smile and expressive eyes that seemed to radiate sincerity. He wore an expensive suit with an easy grace, and when he entered the penthouse, he brought with him an air of quiet confidence. Seeing him, Elara understood why no one suspected him. He was the very picture of loyalty. "Dante," Lorenzo said, his voice full of genuine concern. "Luca said there was trouble. Are you all right?" Dante was standing by the window, his back turned, an untouched glass of whiskey in his hand. "I'm fine," he growled. "My security is not." He turned, and his performance was magnificent. His face was a mask of cold fury and simmering paranoia. "A dead raven was left on my doorstep, Lorenzo, with a personal message. How do you explain that?" Lorenzo played his part to perfection, appearing horrified. "I don't know. The perimeter was double-checked. There was no breach. How is that possible?" "It's your job to know how," Dante interrupted, slamming the glass down on a table, the amber liquid sloshing dangerously. "You are my advisor. You are responsible for my operations. And yet our enemies can stroll up to my front door and leave a gift." "Dante, I am so sorry," Lorenzo said, his voice placating. "I have failed you. I will redouble the security. I will find who is responsible." "I don't care about the pawns," Dante snarled. "I care about protecting my assets." He gestured toward the hallway where Elara was hiding. "Bring her out." Luca, playing his own part, went and gently escorted Elara into the light. She kept her eyes downcast, her shoulders slumped, playing the role of a terrified quarry to perfection. The real fear coiling in her stomach made it easy. Lorenzo's gaze flickered over her, an unreadable glint in his eyes before it was masked by concern. "This is the girl?" "She is not the girl," Dante said possessively. "She is mine, and they touched something that is mine. It will not happen again." He stalked over to Elara, placing a hand on her shoulder in a gesture that was both protective and confining. "This penthouse is compromised. I'm moving her." Lorenzo raised an eyebrow. "Where? There is nowhere safer than here." "An old warehouse we own on the riverfront. Sector A7, Dante said, naming the location of the trap. "It's isolated, defensible. I'm taking her there myself tonight." He looked Lorenzo directly in the eye, a performance of trust. "And you will be the only one I trust to oversee the arrangements. You will go there first, ensure it's clean. Set the security perimeter yourself. No one else. Just you. Can I trust you to do that, Lorenzo?" It was the bait, offered up on a silver platter. The opportunity to have Dante and Elara in a remote location, with himself in control of the security. It was the perfect opportunity, the perfect trap. Elara saw the briefest flash of triumph in Lorenzo's eyes. So fast she almost thought she'd imagined it. He masked it with a look of wounded loyalty. "Of course, Dante. You know you can always trust me. I won't fail you again. I will personally guarantee her safety." After Lorenzo left, promising to see to everything immediately, the penthouse fell silent once more. The performance was over. Dante let go of Elara, and his mask of fury dissolved, leaving a cold tension in its place. "He took the bait," Dante said softly. "He didn't suspect a thing," Elara replied, rubbing her arm where he had held it. They looked at each other, the weight of what was to come pressing down on them. They were no longer just planning a confrontation. They were preparing to walk into one. That night, everything was ready. Elara was dressed in simple, dark clothing. Dante, in a black leather jacket over his shirt, looked every bit the predator of the night. Before they left, he turned to her, his gray eyes serious. He handed her a small, single earring. "This is a communications device," he explained. "Luca and my team will hear everything. When I give the signal, and only when I give it, you do exactly as I instructed." She nodded, her fingers trembling as she put the earring on. "Elara," he said, his voice softer, using her first name without any trace of irony or command for the first time. "It will be dangerous tonight. Do not hesitate." "I won't," she promised. Together, they stepped into the elevator, the silence between them a shared vow. They were walking out of their fortress and heading straight into the enemy's den. The trap was set, the bait was in motion, and the snake was waiting. The drive to the warehouse was silent. The city of Savannah slid past the windows, its familiar lights now seeming foreign and menacing. Every turn, every street felt like a step deeper into the darkness. Elara could feel the tension radiating off Dante. He sat beside her, still as a statue, but she could see the muscles in his jaw working. Warehouse. A7 was on the edge of the city's industrial riverfront, a rusting hulk of brick and steel isolated by dark alleys and shadows. As Dante had predicted, Lorenzo was waiting for them at the entrance, 2 men in black flanking him. "Dante, glad you could make it," Lorenzo said with a welcoming smile, but his eyes glinted coldly under the security lights. "Everything is secure, clean as a whistle. No rooks getting in here." "Good," Dante replied, his voice clipped. He got out of the car, Elara close behind him. "Show me." Lorenzo led them inside. The vast space smelled of dust, salt water, and decay. Weak overhead bulbs cast pools of jaundiced light onto the concrete floor, leaving deep pockets of darkness in the corners. As the heavy metal door rolled shut behind them with a deafening boom, Elara felt a shiver of finality crawl up her spine. The cage door had closed, and then the trap was sprung. From those pockets of darkness, more men emerged. Not 2, but 10. They moved with a quiet efficiency, surrounding them, their weapons raised. These were not Dante's men. Elara knew it instantly. These men moved with a different kind of ruthlessness, and their eyes held loyalty for only one person. Lorenzo's smile widened, his false friendliness melting away to reveal the ugly gloating beneath. "Did you really think it would be that easy, Dante?" he sneered. "You've gotten soft, obsessed with a little stray. Did you honestly think I didn't see this coming?" Dante showed no surprise. He simply assessed the situation, his eyes scanning the men, calculating the odds. "So this is it, Lorenzo, your final play." "The play my father started," Lorenzo shot back, his voice dripping with venom. He was too soft. He believed loyalty could be bought. "I know it must be taken, along with everything else." Elara stood frozen, her hands clenched at her sides. This was it, the moment of danger. She glanced at Dante, waiting for his signal, for anything. But Lorenzo wasn't finished. "I have to admit, using her as bait was a clever move. Only one problem. You assumed she was the only weakness in play." He snapped his fingers. At the far end of the warehouse, a large, wall-mounted screen flickered to life. Elara's heart stopped. On the screen was a live image. Her brother Leo was tied to a chair. His mouth was taped shut, and his eyes were wide with terror. He was in a small, instantly recognizable back office of the warehouse. A masked man stood behind him, a gun pressed to his temple. "No," Elara whispered, the word catching in her throat. The strength went out of her legs, and she would have collapsed if Dante hadn't shot a hand out to steady her. Lorenzo let out a laugh, a hideous sound that echoed in the cavernous space. "I thought, why target Dante's weakness, when I can target the weakness of his weakness? An elegant twist, don't you think?" He had outplayed them. He had anticipated their trap and laid one of his own. He had found the one thing in the world that could shatter Elara's control, her fatal weakness. Dante stared at the screen, his face for the first time showing genuine shock. Not for the boy, not in the way Lorenzo thought, but in pure, unadulterated fury that Lorenzo had dared to cross such a line, to drag an innocent child into their brutal war. But for Elara, everything else fell away. The plan, Dante, the rooks, it was all meaningless. The only thing that mattered was her brother's terrified face on that screen. Her fear for her own safety vanished, incinerated by a primal, protective fire. She was no longer a pawn. She was no longer a victim. She was a sister, and a monster had her brother. "Let him go," she said, her voice a low, commanding snarl that surprised even herself. Lorenzo turned his full attention to her, savoring the moment. "Oh, I will. But first, your master here is going to sign over everything. Control of the wardens. Every account, every contact, every asset. He will transfer it all to me. Then, he will get on his knees, and I will put a bullet in his head, just like my father should have done to his." He gestured to the screen. "Or the boy dies first. The choice is yours, Dante." All seemed lost. They were surrounded. Their plan had backfired. And their true fatal weakness, the beating, terrified heart of Elara's family, was being held at gunpoint. Lorenzo had won. Smug triumph was etched all over Lorenzo's face. He had won, and he was savoring every second of it. "Tick-tock, Dante," he taunted. "Your loyalty to her, or the boy's life?" Dante looked at the screen, where Leo was trembling, and then he looked at Elara. Her face was pale, but her eyes no longer held fear for herself. They burned with a fierce, protective fire, a silent vow that she would not let her brother be harmed. In that instant, Dante made his decision. He had underestimated Lorenzo, but Lorenzo had also made a fatal mistake. He assumed emotion was a weakness. Dante would prove it was a weapon. "You win, Lorenzo," Dante said, his voice heavy with feigned defeat. He slowly raised his hands. "I'll give you what you want." Lorenzo grinned, motioning for one of his men to bring over a laptop. "Wise choice. Start the transfer. Everything." For the next several, agonizingly tense minutes, Dante began the process of signing over his empire under close watch. He typed in passwords and codes, his voice a monotone as he read off security protocols. Lorenzo and his men drew closer, their attention completely focused on the screen, captivated by their enemy's downfall. It was the moment Elara had been waiting for. She was primed for their original plan. In her jacket pocket, she had the small item Dante had given her, a high-powered electronic jammer disguised as a lighter. But now, she saw a better opportunity. A few feet away, leaning against a steel pillar, were several forgotten drums of industrial oil and solvents. With a gut-wrenching scream, she suddenly collapsed to the ground, faking a full-blown panic attack. "My brother! Please, don't hurt my brother!" The sudden outburst distracted a few of the gunmen, who glanced at her with annoyance. Lorenzo just snarled, "Shut her up." But it was too late. The chaos was the signal. As one of the goons stepped toward her, Dante moved. He was no longer a defeated man. He was a phantom of violence. In one fluid motion, he grabbed the laptop and hurled it into the face of the nearest man, while simultaneously drawing a compact pistol from the small of his back. Crack! The first shot rang out. At the exact same moment, Elara acted. Instead of cowering, she scrambled toward the drums. She twisted the cap off a canister of solvent and, with all her strength, heaved it at a large electrical junction box on the wall. The flammable liquid splashed across the panel. A massive shower of blue-white sparks erupted, followed by a great whoosh as the solvent vapor ignited. The main lights blew out, plunging the warehouse into a flickering, hellish twilight of chemical fire and arcing electricity. The monitor showing Leo went black. Chows descended. In the darkness and confusion, the real battle began. At the far end of the warehouse, a massive roll-up door was torn from its moorings, and black SUVs screeched into the space, their headlights cutting beams through the smoke. Luca and Dante's elite team poured into the area, their gunfire disciplined and precise. Lorenzo's trap had been turned inside out. Dante wasted no time. He tore through the firefight, his only target Lorenzo, who was trying to rally his men in the mayhem. Meanwhile, Luca was at Elara's side. "Miss Vance, are you all right?" he growled. "Leo!" she yelled, pointing toward the darkened office. "He's in there!" Together, they sprinted through the battle, covered by Dante's men. Elara felt no fear, only a singular purpose. She reached the office door and kicked it open. Inside, the masked gunman was in a panic, his weapon aimed wildly into the shadows. Leo was still in the chair, sobbing. Before the man could react, Luca was on him, and a single, ruthlessly efficient blow sent him to the ground, unconscious. Elara rushed to her brother, slicing his bonds with a knife from Luca's belt and ripping the tape from his mouth. "Leo, it's okay, I'm here," she cried, pulling the trembling boy into a fierce hug. Outside in the main warehouse, the final confrontation was unfolding. Dante had cornered Lorenzo, both men out of ammunition after a furious exchange. They launched at each other in a brutal, hand-to-hand fight, illuminated by the burning junction box. It was the culmination of a decades-long betrayal, a dance of hatred and vengeance. Finally, Dante gained the upper hand. He slammed Lorenzo to the ground and stood over him, his face bruised, his breathing ragged. He picked up Lorenzo's fallen gun, a hush falling over their immediate area as the battle subsided. "Finish it," Lorenzo spat, blood in his mouth. "Like my father should have." Dante aimed the gun at Lorenzo's forehead. Elara, holding Leo in the office doorway, watched, her heart stopped. This was the moment that would define him. After a long, tense moment, Dante lowered the gun. "No," he said, his voice like ice. "Death is too easy an escape. You will live. You will live with your failure, a prisoner in the same darkness you created." He turned away, leaving Lorenzo for his men to deal with. The battle was over. Lorenzo's remaining men had surrendered. The warehouse was quiet, save for the crackle of the fire and the ragged breaths of the survivors. Amid the devastation, Elara stood, still holding Leo's hand tightly. Her gaze searched for Dante through the smoke. He stood, bruised, exhausted, but victorious. Their eyes met, and in that moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them. The nightmare was over. They had risked everything, and somehow they had won. 6 months later, the Savannah summer had arrived, bringing with it a thick, humid air and the sweet scent of magnolia blossoms. From the windows of the penthouse, the same windows that had once symbolized Elara's imprisonment, the city looked peaceful, its historic squares lush and green in the afternoon sunday. The penthouse had changed. It was no longer cold and sterile. An easel still stood in the corner, but it now held Elara's own work in progress, a landscape of the Savannah riverfront. There were art books on the coffee table and a thriving fern on the windowsill. It had become a home. Elara walked in from the balcony, 2 glasses of iced tea in her hands. She found Dante standing in what had become the heart of their home, in front of the fully restored family portrait. The painting was magnificent. All traces of damage were gone, replaced by rich color and vibrant detail. The beautiful woman seemed to smile with a genuine warmth, and the two children beside her radiated a long-stolen innocence. Elara hadn't just restored a piece of art, she had resurrected a memory. She handed Dante a glass. "You're staring again," she said softly. He took the tea, his scarred fingers brushing against hers. "I'm seeing what my grandmother always told me," he replied, his voice low and gentle. "That my sister's smile could light up a room. I can see it now." He turned to her, and in his gray eyes there was no shadow of the basilisk, only the warmth of the man she had come to love. "Thanks to you. Leo had his surgery. It was a stunning success, performed by the best doctor in the field and paid for by a generous anonymous donor. He was spending the summer recovering, and for the first time in his life, his future stretched out before him, full of promise. Lorenzo was gone. Elara didn't ask for details, and Dante didn't offer any. She only knew that he would never harm anyone again. With Lorenzo's treachery exposed, Dante's control of the wardens was absolute, but there were whispers of change. Certain shadow businesses were being transitioned into legitimate investments. The great ship was slowly, quietly, turning its course away from the darkness and toward the light. "I talked to Leo this morning," Elara said, leaning against his shoulder as they looked at the painting together. "He was showing me a new drawing he did. It's a superhero called the Basilisk, who can turn bad guys to stone with a single look." A rare, faint smile touched Dante's lips. "Is that so?" "Oh yes," she chuckled. "He says he's very grumpy, but that he's secretly a good guy." A comfortable silence settled over them. They had built a life together from the ashes of the past. There were still scars. Elara sometimes still jumped at loud noises. Dante still woke from nightmares he never spoke of. They were damaged by what had happened, but they were not broken. They were healing each other. The story of her grandfather had been laid to rest. Dante understood and respected his silent sacrifice, and for Elara, that was all that mattered. His signature, once a buried secret, was now a part of the story that had brought them together. Dante set his tea down and put his arm around her waist, pulling her close. He looked deeply into her eyes. "My world was black and white, Elara," he said, his voice painfully sincere, "built on rules, control, and revenge. You walked into it, with your defiance and your kindness and your paintbrushes, and you brought the color back. You saved me and my brother," she whispered. "You gave us a future. You saved me from my own past," he answered. "You gave me a reason to want one." He leaned down and kissed her. It was a kiss that held none of the possession or desperation of their early days, but one of promise. A promise of quiet mornings, of carefully built trust, and of a love that had been tested in fire and had not burned away. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the Savannah sun streamed through the window, bathing the restored portrait in a golden light. The past was acknowledged, the ghosts were soothed, and the enemies were defeated. To the outside world, he was still Dante, the Basilisk Moretti, ruler of the city's shadows. But here, in the home they had made together, he was just Dante, and she was his Elara. Together they looked out at the city, not as captor and captive, but as two souls who had found a new dawn in the darkness.